A friend of mine just asked me to give an example of when Congress has given a law abridging the freedom of speech. And this is a very interesting thing to think about because most of the time when we think about abridgments of freedom of speech, we think about proactive, forbidding people to say certain things or to have free speech zones and non-free speech zones, that kind of stuff. But the most insidious type of infringement of freedom of speech historically hasn't actually come from laws that directly forbid you to say certain things. Rather, it comes through censorship that looks like it's part of the free market of ideas and of thought and of speech, but in fact, your voice is being drowned out. So I want you to understand this principle. The answer I gave him was the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve Act created an instrument of printing presses for money. And the First Amendment speaks about freedom of the press. Maybe that's what the people in Congress think of is freedom of the press, is that they get to print all the fake money that they want. But in reality, this does limit your freedom of expression, and it does so very, very seriously. If we had a truly free marketplace of ideas where the government wasn't putting its thumb on the scale through government media and through incentives and subsidies and disincentives, if they couldn't actually pull those shadowy strings of money, much of which is actually laundered through supposedly and seemingly private entities like George Soros, if I can name one, if we didn't have that, just think how free your freedom of speech really would be. If we never had the censorship on Twitter or YouTube or any of these other platforms that appears for all intents and purposes to be politicized, if they were truly private platforms and not actually part of a federal subsidy co-op, then we would be able to communicate much more freely. We'd be able to get our ideas out there a lot more freely. So I want you to think about it in terms of you're running your own newspaper, and then the government is also running its newspaper, and it's using your tax dollars to advertise its own views, right? That would inhibit your freedom of the press. And if you're standing in a crowd and you're trying to say, hey, the butler did it, or the building's on fire, or convey anything that is truthful and useful to the people around you, but then you have all these government goons with megaphones shouting around you, blah, 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 so that you can't be heard, that would seriously limit your freedom of speech. And that is exactly the effect of subsidies and inflation and all this dark money. The moment you give your government power to do that, it will be infringing on your rights. And so do the same exercise with your other freedoms and see how they're being infringed.